Hello, human biology students. I'm going to do just a quick overview, like a 1 day kind of overview of the chapter 14 on the respiratory system. We're going to skip big chunks of this just because we obviously the whole COVID-19 and we're very pressed for time, and I want to get through at least an introduction. This is a very introductory course. We don't really go into tons of detail anyway, but I want you to have this just kind of maybe refresher or overview. Um, so obviously, when we're talking about the respiratory system, we're talking about the lungs and everything that kind of goes along with that taking in of air and exhaling of um, carbon dioxide and things that we don't need in our bodies. Um, let's see. Okay, we're just there. Obviously, there's some differences, even though dogs and people are mammals, there's some differences in just structure. Dogs tend to be better smellers, and this just talks a little bit about why their noses are specialized or their nostrils are specialized in that way. Read that if you like. But we're going to go over just kind of primarily the lungs, how the air gets into the lungs, briefly about breathing. Um, we're not going to talk a lot about pressure and that kind of thing. The second half of the chapter kind of goes into, we're going to skip a lot of that. Um, so, pulmonary, whenever we talk about pulmonary, pulmonary is relating to the lungs. So, pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, occurs by inhalation or inhaling gases from the air. It's actually important as the air passes through that naval cavity that it's both warmed up by the body temperature and also humidified. The addition of that water vapor, the addition of that water vapor to the air is actually really important. It keeps the lungs from drying out. Our respiratory tract is covered with mucus to also protect from that drying. Um, but yeah, that air has to be both warmed and humidified, and that's important in maintaining the integrity of those internal tissues. And we'll talk about, so when we talk about the respiratory tract, like what organs or does that actually entail? We also have some great ways, some features that hopefully keep foreign particles out. We have all of these small hairs and mucus that kind of trap any dust or hopefully pollen and those kinds of things. And if that builds up, it triggers us to maybe sneeze that out or cough and so forth. So we have some uh, mechanisms that try to keep, we can't have that dust in the lungs. And we'll talk when we look at these tiny alveoli, that these little air sacs in the lungs, they're very, very tiny. They're surrounded with all these little capillaries, and they're very efficient at getting, so that when the air goes into here, they're very efficient at allowing that oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream through these tiny capillaries that surround them, and also for the carbon dioxide that's built up in the bloodstream, diffuses from these capillaries back into the alveoli and then exhaled out of the body. So this is a great diagram kind of showing that pathway. So from the nasal cavity, from the nose, in through the nasal cavity, pharynx, which is at the back of the throat. So it passes through here. Larynx is actually the voice box. So larynx and voice box are the same thing. And down through that trachea. The trachea is a very rigid tube. And then into, as we get lower, we we split into two separate bronchus tubes, or the bronchi. And as they break down and get smaller, moving into this lung area, we call them bronchioles. And then eventually they dissipate or branch into these tiny little air sacs called alveoli. So yeah, air enters the respiratory system through that nasal cavity, down through the pharynx, and so forth. I think in a later picture we'll talk about who there's a little flap called the epiglottis here that's super important. So upper respiratory tract, yeah, we kind of went over this already. Those hairs that you actually have in your nose are vibrissae. The cilia are a little bit deeper, so they're hair-like appendages that are not actual hair, made of tissue. But the hairs in your nose, again, super important, and also collecting that, blocking dust and particles from getting um, into the lungs. Specialized cells are odor receptors. That's why we can smell by things that pass through our nasal cavity. And this just goes into some more detail. The pharynx, we said, is at the back of the throat. I don't care about these three parts. We can just skip that. I just want you to know what the pharynx is. We do know that the tonsils are in there. They just happen to be in there. They're more part of the immune system, but that's just where we find them. Again, I don't really care about that. I think you know the tonsils are in your throat, right? Um, Larynx, as it's important, I think, to realize. So that larynx is your voice box. And there's, yeah, I mean, it's a cartilaginous structure. Air passes through. You have, oh, yeah, folds that make up the vocal cords. The vibration of those folds are actually what make create sound. We call that opening in the middle of the glottis. I don't even care about that right now. I'm just going to ask you a series of questions based on the information that I get through here. So that was the upper respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract, we already kind of said, yep, that down this trachea, and you can see this sort of band. It reminds me, and I think they mentioned it in the video you watched on Monday, that there's, hardened kind of rings, almost like a vacuum cleaner hose. But this has to stay open, so it has to have that hardened structure to keep it open so that it doesn't, suck closed with the change in air pressure when you're breathing in and breathing out. So trachea we call the windpipe. So from, if we look at the structure up here, and so we said, yeah, there it is. Um, so yeah, this is just talking about what I just said about that being, rigid. It has like rings made of cartilage that are important for that structure, lined with cilia and mucus. Everything in here is about keeping those lungs clean. When things that go into your stomach, and your stomach has all those digestive enzymes and acids, and it can break things down, your lungs don't have that. That's why it's so dangerous if you get things into your lungs that can't be absorbed by the body. What happens to them? There have been a lot of, we've learned a lot over the years about people who, for example, work in factories where they might breathe in harmful things, or coal miners and that kind of stuff. That stuff gets in the lungs, and your body can't get rid of it. The latest thing we hear a lot about are actually people who work in these places where they make countertops out of quartz. These quartz countertops where so quartz is like sand, for example, is mostly quartz. A lot of, there's a lot of quartz rocks, obviously, so it's a mineral. But if that quartz dust gets in the lungs, there's no way for the body to get rid of it. It's literally like tiny flecks of rock, and it will clog those alveoli, and people can die very quickly from that. And there's no way to clean out something that has gotten, dust like that has gotten deep into those alveoli. Anyway, so cilia and mucus have really important jobs in the lung, and whenever you're working with something that shouldn't be in the lungs, you should wear a mask or a respirator, depending upon what it is. Um, so, uh, we already talked about how the bronchial tree starts with two main bronchi that break down into smaller and smaller components called bronchioles, and eventually all the way down into alveoli, those tiny little air sacs in our lungs, and that's where diffusion occurs. The right lung has three lobes, the left lung has only two. They both are full of alveoli when we get, again, to that smaller, those very tiny air sacs. And we call the membrane that surrounds the lungs the pleura. And so you might hear sometimes of people who have pleurisy, and it's an infection of that um, that pleura. Alveoli, I don't care about the surface area. I just want you to know what alveoli are. We already talked about those. Here's this picture has blown it up a little bit more. You can see these are all those tiny little capillaries. So these are because they're represented in blue, I know that these are veins, even though they're not really blue. But in the red is the arteries. So this is carrying oxygen-rich blood, and there would be tons of little red capillaries that oxygen will diffuse into these little air sacs while the carbon dioxide diffuses out. It's just simple diffusion, diffusing through um, the membrane of those capillaries to an area where oxygen is less concentrated or carbon dioxide is less concentrated. So just know that this is alveoli are all about gas exchange. Super important. That's really all I care about. Um, the lungs produce a lot of mucus. We know that. And again, and those cilia, these are the cilia, the little hair-like appendages that serve to trap dust and foreign particles. Sadly, virus particles are pretty tiny, so sometimes they make it through. That's why we have to worry so much about COVID. I think this point here is important, and I already mentioned it. Carbon dioxide will diffuse from area of higher concentrations to area of lower concentrations, and we could say pressure slash concentration. Sorry, I know it's hard to read. And then I'm going to skip a whole bunch of slides. You'll see them in your notes, but I just want to go really quickly down to um, a quick discussion of the diseases. So we know that there's a lot of diseases that um, affect people's ability to breathe or breathe well. Things like emphysema, asthma. There's lots of people with asthma, and when I was growing up, I think I knew like one person with asthma in my childhood, and it was so. I think a lot of it was they didn't diagnose it, but I do think there's something in our world where people just have more trouble with it. I do think it's more prevalent as well. So first of all, I know it's just more diagnosed because they look for it more. But I really think in children that well, we know asthma can be hereditary. So we know like in some families asthma runs, and that's the case actually with with Hunter, is pretty moderately to severely asthmatic, and so is his dad. So we know that there's a family history there. But sometimes people develop asthma because of lifestyle as well. So it can be something that's brought on by lack of activity, exposure to certain, conditions, and so forth. So I think those are important to at least know. Emphysema people with emphysema end up being on oxygen. typically, and it's irreversible.